Believe it or not, across the world there are dozens of unique, self-declared micronations. Some have populations measured under 1 million, others just have a few thousand, but almost all of them will be lost to history. The Principality of Sealand is the closest example of a successful micronation that the world has ever known. Have a look at this old sea platform, 7 miles off the shores of Britain. This is the place where an eccentric soldier would declare sovereignty, issue passports, and in his view, create a nation, turned very questionable cyber farm decades later. Today we discover the Principality of Sealand. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. The history of Sealand started in World War II, when, as a precaution against German invasion, the British government began sinking artificial islands into the English Channel, as well as other nearby territorial waters. The mission of these steel and concrete islands was simple enough. They would function as lookout posts and AA batteries to assist in the evacuation and recovery of the Royal Navy sailors sunk in the Channel and the North Sea. Naturally, they would also assist with downed Royal Air Force pilots. This was a simple plan, and one of many that had some effect on preserving the lives of sailors, airmen, and civilians. Eventually, at the end of World War II, these outpost islands were abandoned by the British, no longer seeing any use in their existence. And over the decades, they would be dismantled by the United Kingdom or just left to the elements and rot. The sole exception to this was Fort Rough, which was built approximately 7 nautical miles from the English coast. The other artificial islands were only built 3 knots off the coast, meaning they had stayed within the UK's range of full legal authority. Fort Rough, on the other hand, was built at more than twice the distance, and hence technically wasn't an official British territory or possession after the war. This went largely unnoticed until about 2 decades later. The turn of the 1960s brought on a wave of resistance, led by young men and World War II veterans. By then, people had become deeply frustrated with the lack of diversity in British media and publishing. Except for just one TV channel, everything was still run by the BBC. TV and radio broadcasts were still tightly controlled and dominated by more conservative news stories and music genres that were generally very restricted and traditional compared to genres spreading across America. Over time, people became sick of the, quote, bland diet of news, light entertainment, and children's programming, and there were some rather rebellious Brits who decided that it was time for a change. In this tightly restricted media landscape, it shouldn't be surprising that piracy became rampant to an almost impossible degree. British law at the time tightly regulated who could have high-powered radio transmitters on the island, but these men, the rock and roll pirates, would change that. You see, British law had a reduced effect on international waters, and there were plenty of people ready to exploit that loophole, such as the men of the ship Mi Amigo, who started the pirate radio channel Radio Karolina and began broadcasting international music, largely American rock and roll and top 40 lists, to millions of Brits who had little chance of hearing that type of music otherwise. British film director Richard Curtis recalls the feeling of hiding under the bedsheets in his boarding school when he was 8, quoting, "These fantastic guys floating out there in the middle of the ocean, pumping rock and roll into my private school all night." Radio Karolina DJ Dave Cash also stated, quote, "You had no real idea what you were doing until you came ashore and there'd be 3,000 people waiting for us. These men were in fact real pirates, with many of them out there for money and profit. These pirate broadcasts would even play commercials to keep themselves running. This was a bizarre golden age for young British men to make their fame and fortune in complete disregard to British law. And well, this golden age only lasted until 1967. The music and men had made their mark. The BBC would launch its first dedicated pop music channel that year, creating a sea of change in British broadcasting forever. the pirates largely faded under the pressure of international discriminatory laws against supplying unregistered broadcasters, even at sea, and would slowly fade away. In 1973, the BBC and the government began to approve private broadcasters across the island, and many of the pirates went legit. Cash, in true spirit of a pirate, would later say, quote, "I take your money, but I still don't care. And if you need a real pirate over there in America, I'm your man." Now, if we fast forward to modern day, there is a lot to learn from this story, as what replaced the radio, the internet, has some very shady characters. Actually, I want to let you guys in on a little secret. When I first started this channel, I made my personal email address available, leading to an insane level of privacy invasion by scammers, spammers, and all the rest of it. But this was a great learning experience in a way, as it brought a new awareness of just how big my digital footprint really is. This is an issue most of us can probably relate to, and thanks to our sponsor, Delete Me, you now have the power to make yourself anonymous. Delete Me is a fantastic service that will basically erase you from the internet. I'm talking about hundreds of data broker websites selling your information. And it's an ongoing process. Once they clean house, they'll keep scanning for new data that shows up so they can remove that also. So how does it work? Well, Delete Me searches all of the top data broker websites, and on average, they find and remove over 2,000 pieces of personal data for a customer in their first 2 years. To date, they removed over 100 million pieces of data for their customers. Thanks to Delete Me, I could remove old listings containing my vital records like former addresses, professional background, and even family photos. Now, thanks to Delete Me's ongoing monitoring, I can feel confident that I can continue enjoying the privacy everyone deserves. I'd encourage you to do the same. So if you want to get your personal information removed from search results on the web, go to joindeleteme.com/Socash. Delete Me is offering 20% off their privacy plans to all my viewers with my code, Socash. Again, that's joindeleteme.com/Socash, promo code Socash. Thank you, Delete Me, for supporting the channel, and now, back to the Principality of Sealand. Before the downfall of pirate radio, one man, Royal Army Major Roy Bates, had occupied the World War II outpost, Knock John, running the pirate radio station Essex from it until he lost a legal battle with the British government over ownership of the fort. Determined to stay in action, he researched old fortress islands and the possible ships to manage his station from, and found Fort Ruff's Tower, just 6 knots off the British coast and outside legal jurisdiction. But it wasn't enough for him to bring back his radio station. He decided, after consulting with his lawyers and family, that he could double down and make Ruff's Tower something more. After legal consultation, Bates could claim terra nullius, or the law of no one's land, and he did so on Ruff's Tower, and began living on the tower with his wife, children, and few friends. Shortly after moving into the tower, they named it the Principality of Sealand on September 2nd, 1967. He named himself Prince and his wife Princess Joan of Sealand. Now, to hear it from them and their official website, this was followed by an unofficial British incursion into Sealand's territorial waters by the Royal Navy and Marines. According to them, the British military intended to crush their fledgling nation by armed force of Marines and destroyers. Their official history claims that Sealanders fought off the British military invasion with personal weapons and handcrafted projectiles. The only confirmed events were in August of 1967, when the Royal Navy and engineers sunk a decommissioned fort near them and within British territorial waters. They mined the towers, and debris shot wildly around the area, flying close to Ruff's fort. A few months later, his son fired a personal weapon towards a group of Marine workmen trying to fix a buoy near the station. Bates was tried over illegal weapons possession, a significant offense in Britain, but couldn't be charged for it as the incident occurred and the weapons were kept outside of British territory. Despite technically being a British citizen, the charges could not be pursued further against Bates. This was a key moment, as the family used the situation as a de facto act of recognition of independence and sovereignty of Sealand. No major incidences occurred afterwards until 1978, when a group of Dutch and Germans came to the island under the employment of a German businessman, Alexander Achenspach, who described himself as the Prime Minister of Sealand. From here, we don't have much of an official resource beyond Roy Bates' book, Holding the Fort, so these events can be called into some question. Still, the Bates family describes the German and the Dutch employees of Achenbach as mercenaries who stormed the island and briefly imprisoned the prince, Michael Bates, before bringing him onto a fishing boat that left for the Netherlands. When he landed in Europe, he informed his father of the coup, and yes, they do describe it as such, and the family rallied back in England to plan the recapture of the island. The Bates recruited a helicopter stunt pilot to take them to the island. Still, when sliding from the rope ladder, Michael Bates fell hard on the helipad, causing him to accidentally discharge his shotgun. Now, the two men on the island believed that they came with the intent to kill, and hence the mercenaries surrendered. Ultimately, the mercenaries agreed to leave, but Achenbach would be forced to remain. The Bates confined him in an improvised jail for 2 months, making him prepare their coffee and clean the toilets. And this caused an international incident, as West Germany was not keen to let men of questionable legal status hold a German lawyer hostage on an island of dubious national sovereignty. Eventually, they dispatched representatives from the German embassy to London to negotiate his release, and secured him after 2 weeks of back and forth. The Bates interpreted this as another form of recognition of their state sovereignty. This was despite a 1978 West German court ruling that Achenbach could not renounce his German citizenship in exchange for Sealand citizenship, as they did not recognize the territory as sovereign. Either way, Sealand's sovereignty would finally end, technically, in 1987, when agreements by the British Parliament and other world legal bodies, such as the UN, expanded the British maritime border to 12 miles off the rest of the coast, matching many other countries across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. With this decision, any legal grounds for Sealand's sovereignty ended, although the Bates family would never relinquish their titles as Prince and Princess. Regardless, by now they had stopped trying to deter people by shooting and scaring them away, and the British government has since regarded the fortress island as harmless. All further incidents or developments appeared on the artificial island at the turn of the century during the rise of the Internet age. Businessmen from Britain, the United States, and Europe, such as Sean Hastings and Ryan Lackey, contacted the prince with an investment opportunity. The men proposed converting Sealand into a third-party server farm that could distribute data considered restricted or illegal in Europe and America, with the island's nebulous legal state offering a protective buffer from other countries. They had reason to be confident, as even though the British government had expanded its official nautical borders, they had made no move to remove the Sealanders. In Lackey's 5-year vision, he'd be rich, having helped develop one of the first legally free internet gray zones. They began installing the server farm in 2000, naming the operation and company Haven Co. They installed the computers, wiring, and servers into the hollow concrete cylinders that kept the whole structure anchored to the seabed. It would be cooled by natural seawater and giant air conditioning units, while 3 massive electric generators would provide power. Radio waves, fiber optic, and telephone cables would always keep Haven Co. connected to its customers in Europe and America. In a twisted sense, they offered one of the first VPN systems, and they weren't shy with their motivation. They made it clear that if, for example, internet gambling was illegal in your country, you could run your computer connection and websites through them and have access to it anywhere in the world where you lived or worked. Still, they had their principles and wouldn't allow customers to run spamming operations or commit bizarre money laundering. despite mountains of reports, all starting with a Wired article that was followed quickly by international newspapers, magazines, and eventually TV news. Haven Co. fell apart. Most of the business was low-rate online gambling. The promises of redundant security features, including nitrogen pressure chambers in the server farms and armed guards with machine guns, never came. Then, when the dot-com crash arrived, the company that had signed to provide Sealand's fiber optic cables filed bankruptcy and went bust. The operation relied on improvised satellite connection, eventually falling when providers denied service to the company and the island. Eventually, it all went so badly that one of its creators, Ryan Lackey, was fired by the Bates, who took over the remaining control of the company and stole all of his computers to ensure that he couldn't access the servers or compromise their relationship with the United Kingdom. After an in-depth digital autopsy, writer James Grimmelman would say that Haven Co.'s death was overdetermined by its small scale, remote location, and lack of legal sovereignty. Grimmelman also wrote that even formal independence wouldn't have changed the fact that, quote, any nation with an inflatable boat and outboard motor could blow the place up. So despite the hype campaign, it was obvious by 2002 that the company would never reach the heights it promised all the cyberpunks. Even other databases on the English island were generally left alone, albeit monitored closely, and would stay more profitable than Haven Co. could ever achieve. By 2008, it collapsed entirely. Following this spectacular, if not public catastrophe, WikiLeaks supporters openly planned in 2012 to move their servers and operations to Sealand. There was also little to no chance that this would ever work. Assange, as you might remember, spent 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy in London before the Ecuadorian government got sick of the international pressure he would cause by using their consulate's Wi-Fi, Ecuadorian IP addresses, and government accounts. They would throw him back to the British government. One failure would beget another, and eventually, in 2017, Sealand would accept transactions using cryptocurrencies in their online store, leading to further speculation that Sealand would become the new crypto haven. But once again, the lack of incentive, the remote conditions, and the eventual collapse in the crypto and NFT market last year would end any popular idea of this. All this leads to one final question. What is Sealand? It's not technically a legally recognized country by the UN, United Kingdom, or Europe. It's not even permanently inhabited, as the Bates spend much of their time in their homes in southern England. However, small teams are routinely on the island for maintenance and security. You might recognize it as the site of failed businesses and one of Europe's most baffling, almost comical coups. But if I had to call it anything, I'd call it an idea. Roy Bates had an amazing life, volunteering in the International Brigade during the Spanish Civil War and rising to major in the Royal Army during World War II, fighting in Northern Africa and Italy. So for him to come home after years at war to an environment as draconian as Great Britain was in the 60s formed him into a revolutionary to change British public culture by force, making that old single broadcasting system look as obsolete as it was. So I think it's safe to say that he earned that title as the Prince of Pirate Radio before his passing in 2012. His son Michael has taken the lead in Sealand ever since and is still dutifully respecting his father's unique dream. Even so, in more recent years, the self-declared nation has participated in some very mainstream events. In 2004, the Sealand National Football Association partook in their first international game. In 2008, Sealand hosted a skateboarding event with Church and East, sponsored by Red Bull. On May the 22nd, 2013, the mountaineer Kenton Cool placed a Sealand flag at the summit of Mount Everest. In 2015, the runner Simon Messenger ran a half marathon on Sealand as a part of his Round the World in 80 Runs challenge. On the 20th of August, 2018, competitive swimmer Richard Royal swam the 7.5 miles from Sealand to the mainland, finishing in 3 hours and 29 minutes. And perhaps these accomplishments stand in line with the micronation's national anthem, which I'd actually like to perform for you. From the midst of time, in the wake of the storm, came men of the sea, and the legend was born. With a purpose to be free, they searched for liberty, but little did they see the riches of the sea. From the midst of time, in the wake of the storm, came men of the sea, and the legend was born. So proudly now they stand upon their sea-girt land to honor and serve. Their motto, never swerve. From the midst of time, in the wake of the storm, came men of the sea, and the legend was born. Maybe Sealand's future is far from being a paradise in the North Sea, but his story is certainly iconic. Thank you all for watching. Until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.